The world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. You know, I think this is dangerous, giving me this camera and giving me this medium of getting you guys, because I feel like I can do whatever the hell I want. Sorry about that, people. You know, pretty soon I'm going to do a try-on haul, you know, of clothing for elderly men and stuff like that. That, you know, no, I won't do that. I promise you. No banana hammocks for me. So here we go. The last of the dynamic growth components of the antebellum period that I want to tell you about. So I told you about population growth, that's important. I told you about territorial expansion, the dramatic increase in the size of the United States of America in that time. The last thing I want to focus your attention on is the economy. And so let me start the story this way. In the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution, the economy was not doing well. So I'm going to call it a floundering economy. Now, floundering means like a fish out of water, unable to find its way, basically. And indeed, the economy was not doing, the American economy was not doing well. The primary issue was that everything that had worked in colonial America wasn't working as well anymore. Tobacco was no longer kind of having the cachet that it had before. In fact, tobacco really won't revive until well after the Civil War, when J.B. Duke begins to introduce cigarettes to America. And then, of course, unfortunately, tobacco industry is going to explode again. Americans were unable to do the export trade activities that they were doing some exporting, but the general trade activities they had done before. The irony of their separation from the British Empire was that, while in the British Empire they could do what they wanted, but when they were outside of it, they couldn't anymore. Right? You are now regulated by the British Empire, which will tell you when and if you can actually trade with them. So the American economy is not doing very well, and it's kind of it's floundering. It's looking for some other way to go, and struggling, at least in those very first years. Now, it will finally begin to find traction in the year 1793. And I do believe this is one of those critical American dates, because I would argue this is the birth date of the modern American economy. All of a sudden, things are going to start to turn around in 1793 and allow the American economy to go from really struggling to thriving fairly quickly. So what happened in this year, and here's the critical reason for the year is famous, a man by the name of Eli Whitney is going to invent something really important for America. And when he does this, of course, especially for the South, but has a huge impact in America, this is going to begin the transformation of the American economy. So Eli Whitney, and Eli Whitney, of course, for you guys, is a potential identification. Eli Whitney is kind of the reason, for the whole notion of Yankee ingenuity. A Connecticut, born and raised in Connecticut, lived in Connecticut, attended Yale College at least for a while. This classic kind of ingenious individual who actually will contribute a tremendous number of things to the larger global economy. It's not just the American economy, but will make some impacts in a variety of ways. I have to tell you that when I think about Whitney, I think that his most important invention is not what I'm about to tell you about here, that's part of our story, of course, but something else he came up with. And he came up with this concept of interchangeable parts. It's just a critical thing. I'm saying that my problem is that I have all this information in my head that just is there kind of hanging out. And I have to tell you that he isn't the very first person to do interchangeable parts. This was actually done by the Chinese a long time ago. When they were building those terracotta soldiers, they had to build the weapons for the terracotta soldiers. So they assigned them, they were like, everyone was building the same thing. So they actually would make every single part of like the crossbow. And the only problem was that it was the same there were like multiple craftsmen, each one doing the full thing. And they made interchangeable parts that weren't necessarily interchangeable with others. But the Chinese have the incredible situation that they can invent something and then they can forget about it. And they actually did forget about this. But the beginning of the modern application of interchangeable parts comes with Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney will introduce the concept in the production of guns. It's that interesting connection between warfare and technology. In the good old days, every gun was idiosyncratic, which means one of a kind. And the gun maker would make that gun. And if you broke any part of that gun, you had to go back to the gun maker for him to try to replicate that individual part. But Eli Whitney's concept was to make, all these parts that would make up a rifle exactly the same. So every hammer is the same, and every trigger is the same, and every butt is the same, and every barrel is the same. Every single part of the gun was the same. And what he envisioned was you could have like a bunch of boxes in a row that had all the parts to make up a gun, and you could walk down and grab a part out of each box and assemble a fully assembled rifle. You could disassemble it, walk back the other way, do the same thing again. This is an extraordinary concept and is an essence of what will become the Industrial Revolution in the modern world. And the Americans do invent this. In fact, when the Europeans adopted, they called it the American system. But today, everything is standardized. I'm sure you guys know that the shirt is standardized, the buttons are standardized, of course, my belt is standardized, my shoes are everything, you know. The camera that I'm looking at is standardized. If I break some part of the camera, of course, we can replace that. The television, everything, you know, everything in the room, everything you possibly imagine, unless it's handmade, handcrafted, one of a kind, which is very unique for us to have, is going to be, you know, based upon the concept of interchangeable parts. So if we look at Eli Whitney in terms of the grand scheme of things, the interchangeable parts, the standardization of parts concept is huge, with a huge global impact, okay? But that's not what we're talking about right now. So in 1793, Eli Whitney is down in Georgia, and he's just, I can't remember exactly why he's down there, but he's down there. And he's, you know, kind of looking around and, you know, seeing that things aren't going very well down south. Tobacco was not doing very well anymore, of course, and the Southerners are looking for some other alternative. Now, the thing that they were beginning to kind of think about was this plant called cotton. You know, cotton was something that they knew they could grow it. I mean, they actually knew that they could grow it. But there was a significant problem with cotton that became the essential issue. Cotton had actually been grown in the New World for some time. They grew it in the Caribbean, but they grew something called long staple cotton. And long staple cotton, I don't know if you guys know cotton, but cotton's like a bush and has these little pale pink or pale yellow flowers, and it has a really hard cotton ball. Looks like a rosebud in many ways, but it pops open, of course, and there's your cotton ball, you know, all the cotton fibers in there. When this long staple cotton would pop, it had kind of a luxuriant cotton that just would fall out of the cotton ball with very few seeds, and you could hand pick them out and you could do stuff with it. But that kind of cotton wouldn't grow in America, wouldn't grow in the American South. They could only grow what they call short staple cotton. And short staple cotton comes out and pops, but it's a very tightly kind of bunched group of fibers with lots of seeds that are kind of deeply entwined in the fiber. For reasons that I never really asked about, my mom gave me a cotton plant. This was when I was in graduate school. I was doing a history that involved Mississippi in the South, the Antebellum South. And so she gave me a 1-gallon little can with a cotton plant in it. And it never grew very big, it was just small, but it actually did have 3 cotton balls that popped out. It was really cool. I just had it out on my back porch. And when the cotton balls finally popped, you know, I said, well, let's do the thing, you know. And so at that time, my daughters were really little, and so each one of us got to pick one. And as we picked them, of course, we're jump down, spin around, pick a bale of cotton, that kind of thing. And we picked our cotton, and then I told Allie and Katie, I said, I want you guys to separate the seeds from the fiber, you know, the fibers from the seeds. And of course, they just made a mess of it, and you know, didn't do anything. But I carefully did mine. And I pulled the fibers away from the seeds, and I put the fibers in one pile, and I put the seeds in the other. And when I was done, I had pulled 23 seeds from my 1 cotton ball. And it took me quite a while to do it. And it was pretty messy. You know, the cotton fibers were all just messed up over here, and I was having a hard time getting all of the fibers off the seeds. So there's a problem, and it's a classic production bottleneck problem. They could grow cotton, but they can't get the seeds out. And if they used their slaves to do that, the slaves would spend all year picking cotton away from the seeds, okay? Now, you guys have all heard of that famous saying that necessity is the mother of invention, and that's exactly what's going to happen in the mind of Eli Whitney. He looks at this situation, he thinks, I wonder if we can do something about that. Now, I don't know, I'm trying to think of, I'm going to try to explain you what he's going to do, okay? So he builds something that's pretty much the size of a bread box, all right? And the bread box is divided into 2 parts with a center divider between the 2 of them. There it was a cylinder on this side, so it's kind of a round cylinder, and it was attached to a crank, and you know, both of them have kind of an attachment to the crank, and so when you would hand crank, the 2 of them are going to rotate around. This cylinder had large metal bristles on it, something like this, okay? You guys can see that my art has gotten no better over time. And so what you would do is you would dump the raw cotton into this machine here. And these are kind of spinning around like this, you know, and as the fibers would spin, they would grab onto, or as the cylinder would spin, it would grab onto the cotton fibers. Now, the critical thing actually is this center piece right here. So that was a perforated board. So there were really narrow little slits in the board itself. And so when the bristles come around, of course, pulling the fibers could go through, the bristle could go through, of course, but the seeds couldn't. So the seeds were simply pulled away and to be discarded. And of course, in the South, they had so much cottonseed that they had to figure out all kinds. Fertilizer, cottonseed oil, of course, replanting it. You know, there's a whole bunch of things that they will be able to kind of come up with the cottonseed. Now, this side is harder for me to give you an idea of it, but picture like armatures. You know, these are little grabber nabbers, if you will, that are bouncing around, of course, and the bristles are turning. So as the fibers would come through the perforation, these little things are grabbing it away basically. And what you do then is you exhaust a clean cotton, a cotton without it. Relatively simple machine, relatively simple design, relatively simple to make, all of this kind of stuff. And this little thing is going to have a huge impact. And I'm sure you guys know what it's called. Tell me before I put my little cue card up. It's called that's exactly what it's called. It's called the cotton gin, okay? Eli Whitney is the inventor of the cotton gin. And because of this, it's going to transform not only the Southern economy, but it's going to transform the entire national economic situation. It's a big deal, this cotton gin. So what the cotton gin did was, first of all, it allowed cotton to become the king of the South. Remember that I told you that the Southerners routinely were focused in monoculture, a single crop, a cash crop that they would focus their attention on. The first was tobacco, the second was rice. They also did a little bit of indigo, but the great Southern cash crop, of course, is going to be tobacco. Tobacco is not produced to eat. Tobacco is not produced for domestic consumption. Excuse me, I'm saying tobacco, right? Cotton is not produced to eat. Cotton is not produced, of course, for domestic consumption, though it could be a little bit. It is produced for the marketplace. This is the essential cash crop, and one of the greatest cash crops in the history of the world, really. So what happens is, all of a sudden, of course, these Southerners can turn their attention to cotton. Cotton will begin to gravitate across just the entire area of the South. The Cotton King, that's actually a frontier. The cotton frontier explodes across the southern tier all the way out into Texas. Remember I told you those people going to Texas, of course, that was their objective, to be able to grow cotton there. But the first big thing that happens is cotton is going to be the essential economic focus of the South in no uncertain terms. Cotton was king. And of course, they would often begin to call the South the Cotton Kingdom. Because cotton comes, there's a reinvigoration of the plantation system. Tobacco was dying at the very end of the 18th century, heading into the 19th century. It's not doing very well at all. George Washington freed his slaves in large part because he just didn't think it was working anymore. But all of a sudden, there's a whole new reason for the plantation. The system is reinvigorated to focus now, of course, upon cotton. Slavery will be hardened, and this is a tragedy in many ways. There had been kind of a movement away from slavery. Even Southerners were thinking it was a bad idea. But now there's a whole new reason for it, of course, and a greater reason. And we'll see the value of slaves increases dramatically. And here's the tragedy. Well, here's the problem. As the Southerners are embracing slavery ever more keenly, the Northerners, of course, are beginning to turn away from it, setting a stage, of course, for conflict for the future. Anyway, so all of a sudden, here comes the cotton, and it turns in the Cotton Kingdom, and the South embraces it, of course, and it becomes critical. It becomes critical as far as the nation is concerned. Now, cotton, the one thing about the cotton situation is that it seems like it's going to really simply fuel the economy of the South. But it does so much more than that. So what we call this, and this is the ultimate result of the Eli Whitney's cotton gin, we call it the cotton trigger. So the cotton trigger concept is that cotton will be the trigger that will fire off the cannon of the American economy. Cotton is the foundation of the modern American economy. Where it's going to start to build is in cotton, okay? So let me just describe to you how the cotton trigger worked. The South had what we would call a comparative advantage in the growing of cotton. And indeed, relatively quickly, the South is the largest cotton producing area of the entire world. Now that's great, of course, as long as there's a market for it. And if there was no market for what you produce, then you're screwed. But in this case, there was a market for it. There was a demand for cotton in no uncertain terms. Cotton will become the major export of the United States of America. 65% of cotton will be for export. It was our #1 export, and because of that, it becomes the driving force as far as the economy is concerned. Cotton, the Southern comparative advantage, simply played into an enormous British demand. The British are embracing the Industrial Revolution. The early Industrial Revolution is all about textiles. The British were deeply involved in textiles for a long time, primarily in wool. But as they began to mechanize with their spinning jennies and their power looms, they found that wool fibers were fragile and would break under the pressure. Machines were jerky. Hands were smooth, but machines were jerky. And wool couldn't muster. It wasn't up to muster for this situation. So they found that cotton was okay. Cotton was the way that cotton had a greater tensile strength. And of course, the British had no way to produce cotton themselves. So in the very moment that they are developing a huge textile industry, the demand for cotton is massive. The British want that. And of course, the British are going to buy all of this raw cotton from America, and they're going to turn it into textiles, which they will sell to the world and actually become the wealthiest country in the world in the 19th century. So what this means is that cotton is providing an influx of capital into America, into the South. We have to be clear about it. It's coming to the South. Now you would think, here it is, so all the money's coming to the South, so that should just really stimulate the Southern economy. But the critical thing is, it's not going to just do that. It's going to be money to the South, which will ultimately head to the Northeast, which will ultimately head to the West. It will stimulate the entire economy. So let me just give you a sense of how this triggers the entire economy. So we have to envision, of course, the South is producing the cotton, and that cotton is being shipped out, of course, to Great Britain. The money comes back to the South. But the money that comes back to the South, and it does, it inspires a level of affluence, of course, in the Southern elite and their mansions and their fine living and all that kind of stuff. But the Southerners don't really use their money for that many things. They're really only interested in two things. They want to invest in land and labor. Those are the two things that make cotton. So the money that they have will expand their land holdings, of course. They expand their labor holdings, which you and I know, of course, are slaves. But there's so many other things that they need that they're unwilling in many ways to produce. So although they have a lot of money and they're investing it, in to some degree, they're also having to take some of their money and they're going to have to buy stuff for themselves. So, for instance, they're not doing any manufacturing whatsoever. So they're going to send Southern money up to the northeastern part where manufacturing is beginning to be generated because they need things. They need even clothing for the slaves. They also don't have their own financial structures and they don't have transportation apparatus. So again, they look to the northeastern area. Can you provide us with the financial services? Can you provide us with shipping and stuff like that? And of course, the Northeast was absolutely able to do this. So that Southern cotton money is going to the Northeast. Now the Northeast, of course, is beginning to develop a very powerful economy. I'll tell you more about that in a second. But they're also becoming a food deficit area. So they need food. So that means they're looking to the Midwest, what would have been there is the West kind of, the Midwestern area, for food. So that money is not just going to the Northeast, it's going to the West also. So cotton money, is flowing through the American economy. Because it's flowing through the American economy, all areas of the economy are being stimulated in a very, very significant way. So the cotton is the trigger. And don't forget, of course, that cotton was born of the blood, sweat, and tears of the slaves. The slaves make this happen, right? And they are then the foundation of the cotton trigger, of course, which is the foundation of this, growing economy. So all of these things are becoming very critical. Now, as the cotton trigger comes into play, there's a development in the United States which I want to highlight for you, and it's called regional specialization. So that simply means that different regions of the United States were doing different things. I'm sure you guys know that regional specialization is not an uncommon phenomenon. We see even today. We have Silicon Valley, of course, up north in California. We've got biotech industry in San Diego. Detroit was long known for automobiles. Pittsburgh was known for steel. The Central Valley of California, primary agriculture. It's not uncommon to do that kind of thing. But in this moment, the nation was very much, kind of regionally specialized. The different areas doing different kind of things. So I just want to give you a sense of the different areas and what they were doing. I'm going to start with the South, and I've already kind of told you what's going on here. The South was emerging as the cotton kingdom. I mean, it's so perfect. Cotton was king, and everyone in the South were the retainers of cotton. We're having to deal with that. It's estimated that about 80% of the Southerners were in some way engaged in the cotton economy. It really does dominate the scene in no uncertain terms. And so we see the South already, becoming this very important cotton situation. I do want you to know that this is a stimulus for, I'm beginning to get a warning sign. Let's see if I can keep going for a little bit. And we see the growing wealth of the Southern economy through the increased value of the slaves. In 1800, they were only $600 a prime field hand. By 1860, $1,800, the value of the slaves had increased by 3 times during this time. That's an enormous increase in wealth. And the value of slaves would not have increased, of course, if the economy hadn't been doing very, very well for itself. And the main thing I really want you guys to know is that slavery was tremendously profitable. People were making a lot of money. The average holding on profit on slave per annum was 10%, which was more than you would make on railroads at the very same time. So, South was the cotton kingdom, and it was a profitable and viable situation. So I think I better shut down before I absolutely run out. And I'll come back and tell you about the West and the Northeast.